Okay, people are still coming. I am Mary Jane Caspilio, and I represent the Medical Mission Sisters at the United Nations. And I have the privilege to welcome you all and thank you for taking the time to join us in this parallel event during the 62nd session of the UN's Commission on Social Development. And we are glad to see many members of different congregations, organizations, and friends, colleagues, partners, and networks from many and different parts of the world. Thank you all for joining us. In this time and age of progress and advances in technology, industry, communications, mobilizations, and so on, have you wondered why most of the world population are still experiencing poverty? Or why are we still even talking about poverty? And not only poverty, but extreme poverty. This question is backed by the 2023 report of the UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez. The report states that at the current rate of progress or non-progress, about 575 million people will continue to live in extreme poverty by 2030. 340 million of which are women and girls. Yet we know that poverty is not only a gendered issue, but also a generational issue, with young people having less social and economic opportunities as the generations before them. If we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG, by 2030, we need the active participation of the largest generation of change makers, the young and women. As advocates here at the United Nations, the Institutes of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Loreto Generalate and Congregation of Jesus, Maryknoll Sisters of St. Dominic, Vivat International, and Medical Mission Sisters believe that generation equality must be a priority in addressing poverty eradication. Not leaving behind future generations, how do we bridge the growing gap between generations of communities? In this parallel event, we will hear from the voices of young women and experts in the fields of small business, public policy, and academia, and learn from their experiences as they relate to the intersectional impacts of poverty. They will also provide their policy recommendations for their government and world leaders, especially policies that are based on the principles of social justice. As we listen to them, I invite you to ask these questions. What is familiar? What is something new? What are the signs of hope as we work for a just and sustainable future? Now I turn you to Irene or Irene and Kashvi, our young and energetic advocates who will be our moderator for this panel. Irene and Kashvi.
Thank you, Jane, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And as Jane explained, we're joined today by 5 outstanding speakers whose insight into poverty, gender, and youth, I'm sure, will be undoubtedly invaluable for all of us. It is my pleasure to be a moderator for this side event together with Kashvi. Kashvi is an intern and youth representative for IBBM UN NGO. And as an IBBM girl advocate at the UN, she has moderated the International Day of the Girl Summit 2022, and she facilitated dialogue at the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. An alumni of Loreto, India, she's joining us today from Calcutta, where she's pursuing an economics bachelor. Welcome, Kashvi.
Thank you, Irene. A warm welcome to all joining us today. Irene is this year's Spanish youth representative for IBVM in topics related with the UN. She's in charge of promoting UN values among students in Mary Ward Spanish schools and bringing the youth in the country closer to the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. She's also an alumni from one of the Loreto schools in Spain, and she's joining us from London, where she's studying law this year.
Our itinerary for today's event is designed to facilitate meaningful dialogue and the exchange of ideas. Our distinguished speakers will share their expertise and personal experiences, and after their contributions will be followed by a brief Q&A session and a closing statement by María Santos. As we embark on this journey of exploration and collaboration. We invite you to remain mindful of the profound impact that social problems can have on diverse populations. Through dialogue, empathy, and concerted action, we can strive towards a more equitable future. Thank you again for your participation, and let us proceed with the event now. Well, first in our speaker list, I'd like to introduce Jaime Atienza, the Director in Equitable Financing for UNAIDS. Jaime is currently working in Geneva, but he's joining us from Madrid today. He has years of experience as a consultant with global CSO networks, and for more than a decade, he has championed the Inequality Campaign portfolio in Oxfam. As a recognized international expert in financing for universal healthcare and education, his more technical view on measuring poverty and the financial landscape of the matter will help us nicely settle the ground and clarify the more technical and conceptual matters before moving on to a more personal view from the rest of the speakers. So without further ado, I hand it over to you, Jaime.
Hello, everyone, and thanks, Irene, for your very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to join you all, and I have to say I'm really keen to listen from all the young people and the young women that are going to be speaking today. In fact, I was thinking before starting, maybe it's better that I stand back a little bit to listen first and then bring back some general points. But I think this can work also. And I wanted to just give you, I think, a 5 points introduction to the conversation today. And by the way, let me start by recommending you to read the concept note that was prepared for this event. That is actually fantastic. So I would, and I could have taken my points from there, but I refrained from doing that so that you get a little bit more out of someone coming from the outside. As Irene said, I'm working now in the United Nations system in one of the agencies in Geneva, health related, but I've spent some time working also with civil society networks. So let me go for my 5 points. The first one is that we are living in a global landscape of inequality. But when this invitation came to me, for me, it was really eye-opening to realize how little time and how little efforts are devoted to look at the gap between generations and about the disadvantage that younger generations are being placed as a result of multiple policies. Probably these generational inequalities are one of the most invisible and insufficiently targeted, because we have enough data, or at least we have some data about income and wealth inequality, although there's obviously there are hidden figures we cannot get. We are much better in gender inequalities, at least in accounting for gender inequalities that remain really strong and that remain really challenging, but where we have seen some advance, although also retreat, and some backlash in certain geographies. And we also know that human rights, although universal, and under the political declaration that came to the 70th birthday this year, we are seeing also a backlash, and we are seeing how some of those human rights are somehow coming on retreat. So we have these inequalities that are intersecting, that are interrelated, but the youth is basically rarely targeted as a central group or as a central target group. I think as we look at this global landscape of inequality, we can move to a second point I wanted to make. And this second point is that the financing gap for all the human rights, gender equality, education, health, and social protection, which are basic equalizers in our societies, and ensuring sufficient income, tax collection, and avoiding illicit financial flows, which are elements that stand in the way of strong social protection, are now jeopardized by the lack of sufficient financing. When the COVID crisis hit, we saw poverty grow, and in the concept note you have many of those numbers, but poverty grew, many jobs were lost, and millions of jobs were lost, and it was mainly the young population that was left without a job across the world, especially in developing countries. We could see another reflection of that inequality, that was that rich countries were able to invest up to 12% of their GDP, of the wealth of their countries, in protecting their populations from COVID, while in low-income countries it was only 3%, and the countries had very small budgets and had to take in new debts to be able to do that. So we were seeing that this financial space was shrinking and has been shrinking. So we've seen the cost of living, and we're going to get some good examples, I know, but as I look at it from an economic perspective, we're also seeing economic growth that's lower than expected, tax collection that is not climbing but rather stagnating in most countries, and the impacts of the climate crisis that is advancing and also having tougher impacts, especially in developing countries, especially in the regions that are most affected by the global heating or by the highest temperatures, although the impact is all over the place. To look at a concrete example in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have seen that since COVID hit, debt repayment, so the money that a country pays back in debt for previously contracted loans, has doubled, while we have seen health investments decline. So now for every dollar devoted to debt repayments, we have only $1 devoted to health investments. So it's hard to push for that social justice in this context. And as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres put it, the global financial system seems to be broken, as it's bringing more resources to those that already have many, and it's not providing enough to the countries and the people that need it the most. Let me also add one number I cannot refrain from sharing with you, and it comes from the most recent Oxfam Inequality Report released in Davos on January 2024. And just to give you a hint of how this situation is not advancing in the right direction. In the last 4 years, so since 2020, we have seen that the 4 largest fortunes in the world have multiplied by 2. So the 4 richest persons in the world, that are, by the way, old men, have duplicated their fortunes. And on the other side, we have 5 billion people, so 3/5 of the world population, that have grown poorer. This is the context, and this is the context of financing and poverty. That was my second point. My third point is that the Sustainable Development Goals have an uneven turnout. We are seeing some that are advancing, others that are stagnating, and others that are clearly off track. Let me mention you 2 elements, because I work for UNAIDS, an agency focused in the United Nations on the end of AIDS, attending pandemics, and on health systems. So the first thing is that universal health coverage around the world is not improving. It has been stagnating since 2017, and currently we have only 1/3 of developing countries that are increasing their health investments. The second kind of data point would be that out-of-pocket payments, especially by poor people in developing countries, account for 37% of what they spend in health. So instead of being covered by the system, they pay out of their pockets the money that they don't have. So health is opposed to food, is opposed to education, is opposed to other basic needs. And more importantly, because we are talking about youth and about women and girls, adolescent girls and young women in Sub-Saharan Africa are the largest group that gets into new HIV infections. So it's 4 times more frequent to be infected for a girl between 15 and 24 and young women than for a boy or young man. And every 2 minutes, we have a new girl that is being infected by HIV in the region. So again, youth and poverty are a risk factor for, in this case, acquiring HIV, because poverty, transactional sex, and early initiation to sex are some of the reasons behind the expansion of HIV. Finally, my two final points, and I'll try to cut them short, is just how measuring poverty and inequality is critical to be able to advance agendas to improve the lives of the younger generations. And extreme poverty, while one dimension, does not encompass all the different aspects. When we look at relative poverty and you look at aspects like not being able to pay the bills at the end of the month, not being able to heat your house, not being able to have a balanced diet, not being able to go even one day on holiday. Some of these key elements compose, when you get some of these together, you are also living in a relative state of poverty that does not allow you to progress, to study, to have access to technologies, and to abandon a state of poverty or to climb in the throughout your life. I will not get into more details, just to make my final point that I think is the right way to lead towards our younger people here in the call, and it is that there is a need for a strong voice of youth and for a stronger young leadership throughout the world. And I'm thinking political and I'm thinking corporate. We have very few leaders, world leaders, that are females. We don't have women leading the largest companies. We don't have women, or we have very little women leading governments. I was having an exchange with my executive director these past days, and we were counting back and seeing that we had one woman elected as head of state in Africa. Then we had another one that came to be a head of state after the actual leader passed away. And that's out of 50 something. And Africa is back behind, but it's not that in other regions we have a huge amount of women leadership. So while we may think that it's now usual to have women in power because we had great examples, it's not that it's the usual, it's rather a minority, and it needs to improve. And as for younger leaders, the same comes to realization. We need stronger younger voices, we need stronger younger leadership, and also to make sure that the case is made for what is needed. When we think about housing, imagine that the people that are creating the laws, making the legislations, have a housing property. So they don't have the same problems as those that need to get a house or that have a problem in access to housing. It's critical that young people get up to the challenge, get organized, and get to have some space. And I think it's a duty of governments, of the United Nations, and of any other agency to provide with that space, listen carefully, and open that. I think I want to stop here so that we can move to the most interesting part of the session today, that is listening to all the other people that are to speak now. So back to you, Irene.
I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Jaime for his insightful contribution to our event today. Jaime's speech shed light on critical aspects of the global financing landscape, emphasizing the urgent need for stronger cooperation to ensure economic and social justice. His exploration of the diverse yet interconnected needs and challenges of the youth underscored the complexity of addressing poverty and inequality across different contexts. Thanks once again. Our next speaker for the day is Anel Gracie Berga Estela. Anel is a geologist from Universidad Privada Nel Dorte. She has been nominated as a Woman Rock 2022 by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and the World Education Support Organization, and currently serves as director of the student chapters, leading the management of these in 15 regions of Peru. Over to you.
Buen día a toda la audiencia que nos acompaña el día de hoy. Estoy muy agradecida con la Comisión de Desarrollo Social por permitirme presentar y compartir experiencias acerca de la situación actual de las jóvenes en carreras STEAM en Perú. Actualmente, en el Perú, solo 1/3 de todas las mujeres graduadas de programas de educación superior son graduadas de programas de ciencia, tecnología, ingeniería y matemáticas. La falta de representación de mujeres en carreras STEAM tiene consecuencias importantes en el mercado laboral. Por ello, es muy importante analizar las causas por las que las jóvenes no deciden estudiar una carrera STEAM. A continuación, mencionaré 2 causas que he podido identificar y vivir a lo largo de mi carrera profesional. Primero, en las escuelas y colegios no se incentiva a las jóvenes a estudiar carreras STEAM, y si lo hacen es un porcentaje mínimo. Esto dependerá de la ubicación geográfica de dichas escuelas o colegios. Por ejemplo, estudié la escuela y colegio en un pequeño caserío en una zona rural, en donde hasta el día de hoy no se cuenta con internet y la única fuente de información en aquellos momentos eran los libros. Así que, al momento de elegir una carrera, por lo general se preguntaba a un docente o familiar. Por lo general, estos eran varones, que haya estudiado alguna carrera. En mi caso, siempre recibí recomendaciones para estudiar carreras administrativas, tales como contabilidad, administración y negocios internacionales, ya que estudiar una carrera relacionada a ingeniería sería muy difícil para una mujer. Las posibilidades de terminarla eran imposibles. Las condiciones de trabajo de un ingeniero no son las adecuadas para una mujer. Estos eran algunos de los comentarios más resaltantes que recibí al preguntar por la carrera que iba a estudiar. Pero a pesar de todo, estudié geología, porque me encantan las matemáticas, física, química y sobre todo la naturaleza. Y hoy en día me siento muy feliz por desempeñarme en la apasionante área de hidrogeología, aportando soluciones con el fin de gestionar de manera eficiente el recurso hídrico subterráneo. La segunda causa es la falta de un modelo a seguir. En mi caso, no contaba con ningún familiar de sexo femenino que haya estudiado alguna carrera STEAM. Tampoco conocía a mujeres fuera de mi entorno que lo hubiesen realizado. Ese acontecimiento me llevó a pensar que estaba sola en la carrera y no tendría una red de apoyo, pero hoy en día puedo decir que cuento con una gran red de apoyo, que es la ONG Women Mining Perú, que busca realizar la labor de la mujer dentro de la industria minera. Siguiendo con mi experiencia como profesional de una carrera STEAM, voy a indicar que solo tuve dos compañeras en toda mi etapa de estudiante. Fue difícil, pero tuve compañeros excepcionales que me acompañaron en todo momento. Al terminar la universidad, opté por realizar mis prácticas en una unidad minera. Mi equipo de trabajo también lo conformaban varones. No sentí o evidencié acontecimientos en donde me han tratado con inferioridad. Al contrario, siempre mostraron muy buena actitud conmigo, pero en una ocasión me brindaron la oportunidad de dirigir a un grupo de obreros, y uno de los consejos que recibí era que debería hablar fuerte, como un varón, para hacer escuchar mi voz y que estos puedan seguir mis órdenes. En otras palabras, tendría que actuar como un varón para ser escuchada. Fue una situación difícil en ese momento, puesto que era mi primera experiencia laboral. A pesar de este hecho suscitado, logré superarla, ya que recibí educación especial en temas relacionados a habilidades blandas, y esto me llevó a actuar de una manera tranquila con el fin de tomar las mejores decisiones. Generalmente, esta situación u otras peores pasan a mis compañeras que han estudiado ingeniería, como por ejemplo, no ser seleccionadas para un puesto laboral por ser mujeres, no renovar sus contratos por el hecho de estar embarazadas, ser hostigadas sexualmente, entre otras. En el rubro que me desempeño, solo cuenta con el 6% de mujeres que forma parte de la fuerza laboral femenina. Es una cifra muy pequeña. Es por lo que buscamos que muchas más mujeres puedan optar por estudiar una carrera STEAM y realizar su labor. Actualmente me desempeño como consultora y puedo evidenciar que las empresas están buscando incluir a las jóvenes talento en roles muy retadoras. Esto me alegra, puesto que reconocen que el talento no tiene género. Además, enfatizo que los retos de las mujeres al enfrentarse al mundo laboral son muchos, y a continuación resalto algunos: exposición a comentarios machistas o sesgados, producto de las predominantes creencias masculinas, esfuerzo doble por parte de la mujer para lograr un puesto directivo, y que en algunos casos un varón no ha tenido que esforzarse de tal manera para lograrlo. Demostrar activamente ante su equipo que está capacitada para lograr los objetivos de la empresa, o que cuenta con la capacidad física necesaria para realizar trabajos de campo, y además de la poca flexibilidad laboral al ser madres. Para concluir, me gustaría indicar que en Perú se están promoviendo programas muy interesantes para fomentar el incremento de las jóvenes por su elección de carreras STEAM. Además, se busca visibilizar a mujeres con puestos de liderazgo para que logren ser un referente en la próxima generación y puedan inspirarlas a través de sus experiencias. Por otro lado, en Perú se cuenta con una gran brecha de desigualdad que va desde los servicios básicos, sistemas de salud, acceso a buena educación y conexión. Soy muy consciente que estas desigualdades no pueden solucionarse en un corto plazo, ya que es importante el trabajo articulado entre entidades públicas, privadas, academia y agentes de la sociedad civil, para generar mayores sinergias y con ello mejores resultados. Por otro lado, resalto y destaco la organización de dicho evento, ya que me ha permitido mostrar la realidad de mi país, Perú. Muchas gracias. Estoy muy feliz de haber compartido mi experiencia con cada uno de ustedes.
Thank you, Anel, for your contribution. Not only did you present the underrepresentation of women in STEM with a special focus in your country, Peru, but moreover, you tackled a very important point, which is the interconnection between this issue and related inequalities. For instance, Anel addressed the gap in digital access as a potential reason for this underrepresentation. So thank you, Anel, for your emphasis on the importance of role models and supportive networks, and for kindly sharing with us your personal experience or your personal hurdles, as well as your hope that the STEM field is progressively becoming more inclusive and just for women. And next on our speaker list, I would like to introduce Lauren Grant. Lauren is also an intern at IBVM, just like me and Kashfi. She's a recent graduate who's joining us from Australia. Lauren is an alumni from one of IBBM schools in Australia, and she's joining us today to discuss the rising costs of living and affordable housing for the youth. So over to you, Lauren.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am Lauren Grant, and I recently completed my undergraduate degree at the Australian National University. I am a past pupil from a Loroto School in Melbourne, and I'm currently interning as a UN Youth Representative with the IBVM. I'm speaking from Australia, but I'm looking forward to joining Sister Janet in New York next week. Today, I will share my observations on how the rising cost of living, particularly those related to Australia's rental crisis, are affecting youth. I would like to acknowledge my privilege and clarify that I cannot speak to the experience of deep poverty, but I can share how young people on average are experiencing relative poverty. Following my experience, I will share a pre-recorded video from my mum, who works with children born into families who suffer from intergenerational poverty. To give context, in Australia, rent values are growing at an annual average rate of 10%, which is 6% higher than a decade ago. The median income household is currently spending 30% of their income on rent, whilst low-income households are spending 52%. Availability of social housing has halved to 3% over 2 decades, and the number of people accessing homelessness services because of their inability to pay rent has significantly increased. The census conducted in 2021 indicated young people aged 12 to 24 make up nearly a quarter of homelessness in Australia. And finally, the main causes of youth homelessness are domestic violence and the housing crisis. I personally have not experienced homelessness, but as a university student living out of home, I can share how rising costs of living are impacting youth on average. I moved interstate for my studies and have lived in student share houses in Canberra for the past few years. As a student, I lived in the cheapest inner city houses on the market. And despite their relatively low prices, rent accounted for 60% of my income, as I was only able to feasibly work 15 hours a week with my studies. I also experienced a major issue with landlords not being liable to housing conditions. Like many students in Canberra, I lived in an old house with poor insulation, and given the high cost of utilities, it was quite inefficient to use heating. During the winter, it actually gets to about 0 or below 0 degrees Celsius here, which means it's quite uncomfortable to be without heating. It's also very common for students to live in housing with high levels of black mold. I actually lived in 2 share houses where my whole bathroom ceiling was black, and despite reporting this to the landlords, there was no cleaning support. Although these conditions were not ideal, I would not by any means classify my experience as living in poverty as it didn't affect my ability to function. However, what I hope to highlight from sharing my experience is that I'm someone who is fortunate to have financial support from my parents and a part-time job, yet I still live in conditions which are below an acceptable standard. So you can only imagine what it's like for people that don't have that additional support. This issue is not localized to Australia. As someone who has lived abroad, affordable accommodation is an issue around the world, with major cities experiencing a housing crisis. Often the best opportunities are centered in major cities. For example, many of the top universities are in places where rent is extremely high. This means that young people are pressured to seek out rental properties that they simply cannot afford. And realistically, only those that have financial support from family can afford this lifestyle, which drives further inequality throughout society. I have shared how young people are experiencing relative poverty. I would now like to share a pre-recorded video from my mum on what intergenerational poverty looks like in Australia.
I'm Grant, and I'm a counselor in a school. I work in a low socioeconomic neighborhood in Australia, outside of Melbourne. And when I was introduced to the school, I was told it was in an area where they had a lot of generational poverty.
And so what does poverty look like in this suburb?
Australia has a very good social safety net. So you don't see children on the streets or, without proper clothing. Having said that, the poverty here, what it really looks like is you'd see it at home more than you'd see it in the way they present. And it's a lot of domestic violence, mental health issues, and substance abuse amongst the parents.
Mm-hmm. And so what kind of problems do you see in the children at school?
A lot of problems with children. Mostly it comes out through behaviors and emotional de-escalation. Mm-hmm. So we saw a lot of children who just really can't sit in class. They just come to school sad, sometimes angry, any number of kind of emotionally dysregulated states, and sometimes quite violent as well.
Mm. So how can you solve the problem of intergenerational poverty?
We have a better understanding of what trauma looks like, because when children live in an environment with domestic violence and parents who are drug affected and unpredictable, the children go through a lot of trauma, and trauma plays out in many ways, and it goes on to the next generation and the next generation. So our goal, and we do this collectively as a school, is to teach children tools for dealing with emotions, so that they don't repeat the behaviors that they grew up with. We're trying to teach these kids not to be physical, not to be aggressive emotionally, and then how to keep themselves calm. So yes, the way we see going forward is working with children and teaching them a better way and showing them a better way.
How have you seen the cost of living crisis impact people in this?
So we are seeing more food insecurity, definitely. We have programs where we distribute food through the school community, and we saw a lot of uptake on that. There are stories of people living in their cars. I've heard this from colleagues, and although it's not at our school, a neighboring school, they reported people living in the forest or bushland near the school. So yes, we're seeing. And I guess we're seeing this play out emotionally, because when the parents are really stressed, it also plays out on the children as well. So yes, we're seeing, I guess, a lot more dysregulated behavior than ever.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. That's my experience.
I express my sincere gratitude to Lauren for her insightful contribution to our event today. Lauren's first-hand account of the challenges facing youth, particularly in the context of Australia's rental crisis, provided a poignant and eye-opening perspective on the realities of relative poverty. Her perspective on the intersectionality of housing affordability, education, and socioeconomic opportunity underscored the far-reaching implications of the rental crisis for youth across the globe. Thank you, Lauren. Our next speaker for the event is Pooja De. Pooja is a Rainbow Student Scholar, entrepreneur, and customer service executive from India. She's currently working a job while simultaneously running a home-based small fashion designing and crochet costume startup business. Just a reminder that we're sharing the full speaker bios in the chat. Welcome, Pooja. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm Pooja De, an ex-student of Loreto Rainbow Home. Currently, I'm employed as a customer service executive by Flipkart. To my opinion, higher education plays a big role if one has to fight with poverty and compete with the growing world. We all know that free educational opportunities are now available for all in India, and policies are made to boost the education of girl child as well. But the problem arises as a big number of girls from the lower class drops out from school every year after their secondary education. Mostly after their secondary education, they are mostly forced to marry by their parents, or sometimes by their own choices, they do that. For example, when I joined Loreto Rainbow Home in the year 2004, we were all around 15 girls in the same batch, in the same class. And by the time I was in class 5, the number went down to 7. By the time I was in class 8, the number was only 2. And when I was in my class 10, I was the single girl who was appearing for secondary education from Loreto House Rainbow Home. So what happened to the rest of the 14 girls? So as per my knowledge, with few with whom I am in touch with still, they got married when they were pretty young, and now they are housewives, fully dependent on their husband's income. As a result, their lifestyle remains the same, and their kids may face the issues to compete with the present competitive world now. Now, talking about those girls or female who gets into the higher education or vocational training, but are not contributing financially in the family. I'm talking mostly about the lower income group. So this is another issue why they are unable to eradicate poverty from their life. This is usually happens because either they are after completing their education, they are not looking for a job, or they are not allowed to do a job. Usually this happens to a family where a woman is married and they are not allowed to go out and do jobs. Even unmarried girls sometimes are not allowed in the family, and they are assigned only with household chores. So I feel only educating the girl child is not important, but for them to get into a job after their education is equally important to fight the growing class division here. And in respect to the higher education, I feel there is a huge language barrier here in India between the upper class education and lower class education. For a girl from a free education, when a girl gets free education from a government school, and that is the only option for them. And we all know that in government schools, the medium of education is native language. Although English is taught as a secondary language, but speaking in English is never considered important. As a result, this student faces challenges when they go out to search for a job in private companies. Speaking in English has become the need of today's world, and the student faces discrimination here. Here, the equality is never enjoyed by them because carrying the same degree by a student of a private school and a public school faces differences here. So here, the only way to fight this issue is if these people who are studying in a public school can get into a sort of small business and become self-entrepreneurs or employed, and if they're provided with the right opportunities and trainings. So considering my own life, for me, getting into a job was easy because I could speak in English, but I always felt that having a small business is better than level 1 jobs. Hence, I have self-learned fashion designing. And beside my full-time job, I have opened a small home-based fashion designing startup, catering to firstly to friends, relatives, neighbors, and now to my residential area. But if I think of taking this business to another level and to go out in a bigger way, capital plays a very big role here, and it is not at all easy to get a loan for this small startup business. Hence, here I conclude by saying that real opportunities has to be made available to eradicate poverty, like speaking in English should be made mandatory, rather just treating it as a subject, opening up more vocational training centers, and then after vocational training, job placement opportunities should be available. And vocational training centers and those who want to open their own small startup businesses, I feel a sort of support needs to be there for them, or sort of policies, so that they can start their own business, maybe by taking small loans. So that's all from my end today. Thank you so much for hearing me.
Thank you so much for your input, Pooja. I think you all learn a lot from your personal perspective on the obstacles surrounding the connection between poverty and education. And also you tackled barriers which materialized beyond the on-paper solutions like dropouts or child marriage. Even when girls are effectively able to complete a formal education, it is oftentimes the case, as Pooja pointed out, that they find themselves without job opportunities or tied to unpaid care work at the household. So thank you, Pooja, for reminding us of the importance of intersectionality in language barriers. The experience of a higher class girl will be always different than that of a lower earning community. And your discussion of entrepreneurship was also very inspiring. So thank you for joining us today. Next on our speaker list, I'd like to introduce Brantella Williams. Brantella is currently a sanctuary scholar at York University, pursuing an honors degree program in political science. And she's also the project coordinator of S4 Collective. I just want to remind everyone that the bias for the speakers are being sent to in the chat box. Brantella is an advocate for equality and access to higher education and attended the high-level political forum last summer, so I'm sure her contribution will be very enriching. Thank you for joining us today, Brantella. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Irene. Good day, everyone, colleagues, advocates, and activists, scholars, and community leaders. It is with extreme pleasure that I express my gratitude to be a representative on this panel to speak with all of you. Today, I will be discussing the theme of SDG 1, poverty, concerning SDG 4, quality education. Now, as we listen to my message, bear in mind this equation. Poverty equals displacement equals migration. There is no denying that education is a tool to escape the cycle of poverty. Education is not merely an opportunity to improve one's quality of life, but it is the foundation of progress, empowerment, and equity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the UN, Article 26 states that everyone has the right to education, begin quote, to promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, race, and religion, end quote. However, Canada continues its exclusionary practices. With a population of over 500,000 plus undocumented migrants, an overwhelming number of youths are denied access to post-secondary education. In doing so, they are deprived of the chance to learn, to grow, and to contribute to society in a meaningful way. This inequality not only suppresses an individual's potential, but also hinders society's progress. Many marginalized, racialized, and migrant communities are usually ostracized from the conversation of inclusion. They are the invisible subset of society that contributes to its economic growth, but are denied its privileges and protection. It is important to note the nuances of precarity that the immigration system creates, as persons living with precarious status are individuals who repeatedly fall into the cracks of the immigration system. By rejecting access to post-secondary education for a segment of the population, Canada continues to participate in widening the gap of inequities. In addition, Canada continues to fall short of the SDG by recently implementing a cap on the amount of international students hoping to access higher education. As a member of the migrant community and an advocate for equitable access to quality education, I have witnessed and experienced firsthand the negative impacts of individuals unable to achieve their academic potential. There are countless pitfalls and barriers associated with a lack of access to education. For many precarious, racialized women without status, this means a cycle of housing and food insecurity domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and various mental health issues. Many vulnerable migrant workers are forced to remain in insecure employment, which results in a loss of social protections and involuntary low-skilled, low-paid, or unpaid jobs. With no legal recourse, they are at the whims of their employers and exploited in unfavorable working conditions. Lack of accessible education only adds to the complexities that already exist in these marginalized and vulnerable communities. Many racialized and marginalized areas within Canada are facing inequitable learning conditions as they are understaffed with limited resources due to the lack of government funding. When it comes to bridging the poverty gap, access to education is believed to be a top way for an individual or individuals to escape poverty. Canada should be at the forefront of the fight for accessible education for all, as the beginning of dismantling the legacy of colonial exploitation. Society as a whole will not be able to progress if a percentage of the population is denied access to basic rights. If Canada truly intends to reach the 2030 SD goals, which is in 6 years, it must regularize its undocumented migrants. Regularization calls for the granting of permanent status for all undocumented migrants residing in Canada. It would simply follow a replication of the 1973 regularization campaign that granted 39,000 migrants status. Regularization will create multiple pathways of access to permanent residency, universal social protections, access to education, and structural changes in the labor market. There is no one-size-fits-all programs. Policies need to reflect the unique inequities that exist within a given society. There needs to be public investment in health and education on social protections. Our task at hand is to improve, acknowledge, and reconceptualize the internal borders that exist within the education system. It is our collective responsibility to dismantle these barriers. Irrespective of one's background or status, everyone has the chance to learn or should have the chance to learn and succeed. Migrants need to be a part of the conversation if society ever intends to progress its overall growth. As a developed country that prides itself on being a welcoming, diverse nation, Canada has the responsibility to be a leader on the international stage in the effort to eradicate poverty. Canada must maintain its commitment to the SDGs and invest in human development to achieve lasting economic growth. Global governance requires collective and collaborative effort, if paramount to fostering an equitable global economy. Investing in education is more than a moral clause. It is an investment in a brighter future for all. It is crucial to unlocking innovation, fostering economic growth, and building more resilient and inclusive societies. Education is not a privilege. It is a human right that must be protected for the advancement of all. Thank you.
I express my sincere thanks to Brantella for her powerful and enlightening speech. Her poignant analysis of the intersectionality between poverty, displacement, and migration highlighted the urgent need for inclusive policies that address the systematic barriers faced by marginalized communities. Furthermore, her compelling policy recommendations, including the call for regularization and multiple pathways to permanent residency, offer concrete steps towards dismantling existing inequalities and fostering a more just society. Thank you, Brantella, for your unwavering leadership and invaluable input.
Thank you, Casby, and a very sincere thank you to all speakers for your enriching contributions today. We would now like to open the floor to questions from the audience, which you are more than welcome to write in the chat box. The speakers themselves can respond to these questions in the chat box as well, if they wish. And I request the English-speaking audience to kindly move to the English channel for the global icon. We already have our first question for the panel to discuss, so speakers feel free to jump in if you want to share your response to this question. Which is, what policies do work? It seems that we tend to focus in our effort to critically criticize the policies that are currently being implemented, to focus on what doesn't work. So the question for the speakers today is, what policies you think can be implemented and what measures can be taken which can deliver the objectives and the goals that the Agenda 2030 pursues?
Just a reminder, the speakers can raise their hands and we'll recognize them. Thank you.
Hello, I'm not being able to raise my hand. I don't seem to find the right place. So just I want to be very short. I would just like to mention that on policies that work in terms of including women, and especially including adolescent girls, young women, and women into the political system and into the economic system. We have the policies that provide job opportunities, that require public investments. To get enough and sufficient public investments, you need progressive tax collecting systems and to avoid illicit financial flows. And that at the same time will help reduce inequalities. When you get the right amount of tax collection and revenue collection, and in times of crisis, you can use debt mechanisms, then you can provide universal healthcare, you can provide universal access to education, including even access to tertiary education when that is the case, and that would mean actual progress. I can't hold, but I can't hold from rolling back a little bit to Africa, the region I work more intensively in, and secondary education is not something usual, it's not universal, and secondary education is a critical issue for the improvement in young girls' lives and in their capacity to access the tertiary education and job opportunities. That is, of course, because I come from an agency focused on health and on HIV, it also keeps girls safe from certain practices and from certain from the worst environments, but definitely it's one of the boosts for progress and for upgrading in society for young girls and adolescent girls and young women, sorry. I think I will stop there to listen to my colleagues for whom I have a question, and I wanted to ask all of them if I can take the opportunity, just if there's one thing they would like to see changing in their next 10 years, what would that thing be, so that we can also think of policies in a concrete way of the achievements that those policies should try to accomplish. So over.
Thank you, Jaime, for the wonderful question. Our panelists are open to answering that.
Jamie, I would really like to see more women in positions of leadership. I know in Australia, only 22% of women are CEOs, which it might be a relatively high statistic compared to other countries. But this is definitely something I would like to see more of, and something I'm passionate about empowering young women to strive for.
Well, I have a point here to make. I would want more women to participate in financial well-being of the family. Here, I feel it's mostly the men who takes a responsibility to run the family, to earn. But I feel if, it could be done in both ways. If women can also contribute to the same way, the standard lifestyle becomes better.
Thank you so much. We now have a question from Patricia to Anel. So Patricia asks, two of our principal concerns right now related to the mining crisis and the mining activity in Puno involve the absence of the implementation of the ILO Convention 169 regarding the rights of indigenous people and the contamination of the water environment by toxic metals and irresponsible mining. Anel, would you like to answer that?
Okay. Dear Patricia, thank you for your question. Currently, I work in a formal mining. This developed with rigorous standards. The main priority is sustainability develop, care of the environment and relations with the communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Anel.
And Kashfi, I think we have another question in the chat box. for all the panel, and it's coming from Luis Nolta, who asks, what are ways that we can really make a difference with these problems and issues? It happens mostly with girls and women. How do we change the idea about gender? So this is open to all speakers, in case any of you wants to jump in.
I guess I can speak to this as I'm working in this space at the moment. It's definitely changing gender norms from a really young age. So jumping in and educating girls as early as you can, and just busting myths about gender and kind of making them aware of their own subconscious biases that they have observed, and then empowering them to go out and make a change, or encourage them to study, I guess, STEM pathways or different things like that, and showing them a path that they can do that.
Thank you, Lauren. We have another question here in the chat. What do you do to develop partnerships with potential businesses that provide the access to jobs, education, and development for your population? It's an open question to all the panelists.
I can answer this one as well. From my experience, actually, there's a huge demand from industry to engage more women, especially like young women, in employment opportunities. I know in a lot of male-dominated industries, there's diversity targets that they really have to reach. The challenge that they're having is actually finding the advertising to women or reaching that base of young women. So sorry, now I've forgotten the question, but basically I think it's making women aware that these opportunities do exist. I think so often women self-select into certain pathways and don't look beyond that. And so by showing them that there are a lot of programs that are there for them, that's something I'm passionate about.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lauren.
Oh.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes, I would also like to add that with advocacy, it creates a lot of community working in community partnership. So what we do for developing our population is like do a lot of workshops, raise awareness of what the rights are, what the possibilities are, how can you connect and how can you work within your community. So I think these are some of the ways that community is super important when discussing how to develop develop your population.
Well, if none of the other speakers wish to address this question any further, we have another question from Cecilia Dwyer in the chat, which is similar to the one Jaime suggested a couple of minutes ago, but it's the reverse one. So if you had to share one thing that you want to see in the next 10 years not happening, but stop from happening, something that you want to be removed from the current social panorama, what could it be? Something you want to see eradicated in the next 2 years?
I can tackle that one. I think it's a pretty straightforward question. What we're all here for, I think potentially the eradication of poverty. It's so intersected and it's so complex and layered with so many barriers, labels of oppression. And so once that is lifted, it creates a space for all these other equities to occur in society. So I would definitely say I would love to see poverty be eradicated in the next 10 years.
I would personally like to see domestic violence eradicated. It's a big issue in Australia and something that really impacts, as my mum spoke about, intergenerational poverty and women's confidence and ability to progress further.
Thanks so much, Brantella and Lauren. Another question that we have is from Jaime for Brantella. On migrants' regularization, are you part of beyond national movements other than Canada? Is there an opportunity there?
And beyond national movements meaning outside of Canada? So I'm not a part of beyond national movements outside of Canada. I think what happens is that immigration is such a let's say it's spoken of so negatively, and it's such a very disgraceful way to categorize human beings who are trying to make a life for themselves. And so I think when the discussion becomes, because what the idea is to promote democracy, when the discussion begins within I would just say the global north or developed nations, it starts to move within our flow within other countries. So I think what I would say is that there's I'm please hope I'm answering your question correctly. I think there is an opportunity to start the conversation in reconceptualizing how we view immigration and how the system creates these ideas to commodify human beings. And I think once we start to do that, we start to have a different conversation of human rights and what that can look like within a given society. So I think, I hope I answered your question once again, there is an opportunity there for the conversation to begin. So yes.
Thank you, Brentella. We have another question in the chat. To all the young advocates, you did well, you're confident, congrats. How do you motivate and inspire girls of your age? Do you think girls of your age are as confident as you all are?
Okay, I'll go ahead. I think actually they actually what give us confidence to do the job that we do and to continue the work that we do is by seeing all these amazing people who are under this strict oppressive ideas, who are limited, who are not able to move, but to see how happy they are, how ecstatic they are to work with you and be a part of something that gives us the confidence to push to do what we need to do. So actually, they're the ones who give us confidence. So yes.
I can speak to this as well. I'm sorry, it's again an Australian experience. I know in Australia, like girls are very confident in high school and tertiary education. We actually have higher levels of women in tertiary education than men. But there is a problem when women enter the workforce that something happens to their confidence. I don't exactly know what, but girls don't progress to middle management. Women don't progress to middle management at the same rate and don't seek out promotions at the same rate. And so figuring out what it is that drives that change is something I'm really, would like to investigate further. But I know that it is a statistical problem that confidence really drops following tertiary education and kind of early entry into the workplace.
Well, I would like to contribute here as well. So here with my experience, I have done a lot of time of my age when I meet them, few of my friends, and I speak to them. They speak about their housewife mostly, and they speak about their issues in their family, the violences they are going through. They have financial issues. Then I usually ask them that if they have financial issues and they are educated enough, they can go out and look for a job. And when they are self-dependent, then they will not be treated that way, the way they are treated now. Being a housewives, they are not treated well. So I think that is another way we can ask girls to be self-dependent, and so that poverty can also be eradicated if they are self-dependent in their own families. It starts with their own families.
Thank you for the wonderful answers. It was a great experience. We now have the floor open for questions from the audience. So you may raise your hands and we'll recognize you for the questions. Our first question is from Donna. Donna, please go ahead.
So thank you for your presentations and the diversity of views that you represent. What I keep wondering about is the mental health issue, and I'm in California, where I see in the United States a rise in young people who are really suffering from depression and a variety of other mental health issues that are really going unaddressed. And I think there is a connection between job insecurity, domestic and dating violence, struggles to find voice, and struggles with authority within the system. And there's kind of a, I don't know which, does that cause the mental health illnesses that we see? Or is there an existing mental health problem that's growing, that's leading to job insecurity and struggle with voice and domestic violence? It's like, which is first? I know there's a connection, but what's the causal direction? And I don't think there's enough research being done into the psychological impact, particularly on women, of homelessness, hunger, poverty, immigration, climate change, the whole mix of things that could easily spiral out of control. So, have you done any work in psychological, and I want to say psycho-spiritual impact of all these things on women in particular?
Thank you, Donna, so much for your question. It's a really interesting perspective. I haven't done any work in the area. I guess I can only talk to factors that I think may be contributing to that. I guess social media is a very obvious one. I think we're constantly fed like a lot of diverse media that isn't necessarily good for us. It's quite polarizing. Another possible contribution is like loneliness. I see a lot of my friends who are my age. Maybe that's because they don't move out of home, and culturally we kind of stay at home during university, but quite lonely. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer, but definitely interested in learning more about that problem.
Thank you, Donna. I also don't do much work in psychology, but I think my one course in psychology would help with this question. I would say that, and one of the important things that you brought up is research. There isn't enough research being done on the effects of mental health with women. And I think they are directly correlated. I think, yes, economic situations do create this sort of does create or does impact the mental health of many youths today. And I think also because we are coming more into the idea of mental health. Before, it was taboo, it wasn't discussed as much, so we weren't able to envelop how deep mental health issues even occurred with the generation before. So now that we're having more of a discussion how the impacts are, we are seeing there's definitely a direct correlation between intersections, gender, race, and economic class. So I think for sure, yes.
Thank you so much. If no one else wants to address that question, we'll now move on to the next question. Anyone who wishes to ask a question can raise their hands. All right. We also have another question for the panelists here today. If we are to advance policies targeting poverty reduction among the youth, what are or should be the institutional processes guaranteeing that young people get a say in these decisions, especially at the UN level?
Shall I
I
go
guess I
ahead,
can.
Kashvi?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, it took me like 30 seconds to raise my hand, so finally I managed to do that. I hope you are compassionate with the older generations here. I take that point, and I think it's a critical one, because as I made the point, and you are speaking about your experiences and how to advance and to progress every single day through your lives and through your actions. But of course, we need institutionalized spaces, and those need to be granted at government level, at community level, at local government level. And when we think about the UN, we need to have in our different governing bodies and boards participation from youth. I happen to be part of a joint program of the United Nations where we have 11 UN agencies, and we also have seats in our governing board for different groups of community organizations, civil society, and also there are representatives from youth. I think we need more and more youth representatives, and also some specific policies to ensure that young people get more easily into positions, into every position inside the different UN agencies, to make sure that there's not like that there's enough space to get those views and those concerns and the kind of vision that comes with belonging to a certain generation to realization. And I think those are policies that go from human resources to political and governance. So I think those are the kind of policies that need to be undertaken, and UN is only an example, but I think we need to look at governance level, at government level. And I would say also when you look at companies and there are stakeholders, spaces for representation of the different groups of interest of a certain sector, youth needs to be given a special voice, because otherwise normally it will not be granted. And I think especially young women will not have that voice if the door is not open, then you will probably push it and get the right space, but it's not as easy as it should be. So there's a lot of space to advance. And I would like to leave a short memory from a visit I did to Nairobi some years back, and it's because I could watch myself a very empowering example of a young woman that was such a role model for young girls. And I was surprised at the beginning. I was a bit challenging my own views. I was walking around the Kibera neighborhood in Nairobi. That is a huge, very poor neighborhood. And I was walking there with two people from the that were locals, that were guiding me and another colleague. One of them was called Sita Moji. She was a queen of beauty, 18 years old, and she was the one that was walking the neighborhood, visiting the schools, speaking with the families to make sure she could speak to young girls so that they could stay at school. So she could be speaking with parents so that they would keep parents at school, and she would be speaking with other young girls so that they could take their time to advance their lives and avoid many of the risks that they would be facing. And that was a very down-to-earth example of some of those very inspiring, I think, role models and young leaders I've been coming across throughout my life. So I just wanted to mention that quick example because we don't have that much of Africa in the panel, so I think it's good to get a little bit of that.
Thank you, Jaime, for the wonderful answer. We have one last question from Sister Louise. What do you think our older generations can do?
I think I'm just going to add on to, because it sort of follows up the question before previously. I think what we can definitely do is, as Jaime represented, not to gatekeep the governance or political landscape, have youths be more involved, be able to have a say, not just have a say as in performative advocacy, but actually have a say in what policies, etc., are even done and on a UN level, because there are lots of UN youths. It's just that they're not in the forefront, which would be very important because they are the next generation who will be leading the UN. So I think it's very important to have more of a prominent space for youths to actually do the work, because they are there and they are present, but to be to do the work and to be more more of a functioning tool rather than just a tool on a shelf. So and I think older generations also are doing the work, and they also should continue to do so, but don't give up and be more receptive to youths entering the spaces as well?
I think the biggest challenge that we're seeing between older generations and youth is that things are changing quite rapidly amongst like the younger population. So I know personally, like, so there's been so much change in my generation around technology and even like gender norms, which are, I think, really great and progressive. But I think it can be quite challenging for older generations to move at such a fast pace. And I guess I ask as a young person for older generations to diversify their media intake and news outlets to understand that the kind of change that we're going through, but also to communicate between the different generations and on why. And I think it's just understanding different perspectives.
Thank you so much, Brentella and Lauren. Thanks once again to all our speakers today for such an enlightening event. I would now like to hand over to Marides to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Kashbi and Irene, for your fantastic moderation. Hello, everyone. I'm Marides Santos. I represent Vivat International at the United Nations. Thank you to our speakers, Jaime, Lauren, Brentella, Anel, and Pooja, for shedding light on crucial issues and for sharing your experiences and policy recommendations. The comprehensive insights into the challenges young people face, especially regarding poverty, gender inequality, and digital exclusion, are essential for building a more just and inclusive future. You highlighted pressing issues faced by the largest generation of young people globally and emphasized the need for inclusive policies rooted in social justice principles and the pivotal role of education as a tool for breaking the cycle of poverty. The discussions on measuring poverty with intersectional concerns and addressing challenges like displacement, migration, rising living costs, and barriers to affordable housing were enlightening. Your commitment to creating a more equitable future is inspiring, and I'm grateful for your efforts in amplifying the voices of young women and experts from various fields. To our young women, we are amazed by your self-confidence and the hard work you are doing. Thank you to all our participants for your engaging presence, which enrich our encounter even more. Thanks for the excellent work of our technical team, Sarah, Ana Paula, Janet, Jane, and Mahi, and to our able translators, Isabel, Giovanna, and Patricia. Thanks to our sponsors, Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Loreto General Aid, Maryknoll Sisters of St. Dominic, Vivat International, and Medical Mission Sisters. Let's continue working towards the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, fostering opportunities for all to live with dignity. Together, we can drive meaningful change. Have a good rest of the day, everyone. Thank you for being here. Goodbye.